Now, this video is going to be a bit of the redemption second chance that this book series deserves. Because I started reading this series when I was very young, and I couldn't quite get into it at the time. And also during that time, there was a movie adaptation made off of the first book, and it honestly didn't represent the book in the best light, as I learned in later years. So we're going to jump right into it. This is going to be the inheritance cycle. Most people would probably know it as the Eragon series. Um, but like I said, I had trouble getting into it when I was younger. It was only when I was getting into my adult life, I had decided to hop back into it and give it another chance. And I realized that the material was far more intelligent and adult than I ever realized when I was younger. And it honestly, I was super interested and fascinated by the story jumping back into it. And I developed a whole larger appreciation for the story as a whole. So, the first one in this book series is, of course, Aragon. That's the one the movie was made after. And I mean, it was all right. You can watch it if you want to, but it's not really the best representation, as I said. But basically, you have a character named Aragon. You find him in this outlier village in a country I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of. I think it's Allegacia. But he's basically leading a simple life and he's trying to figure out what he's going to do for the rest of it without realizing exactly how much of a turn his life is about to take. So he's basically out hunting, I believe it was, and suddenly this massive blue sapphire of a stone appears out of thin air and honestly scares the hell out of him, to be honest. And he takes it back home and eventually realizes that it's actually a dragon egg when it hatches in his own house. And things kind of spiral from there. So, more about the actual world that he exists in. One thing I like about these books is that at the start of every single one, it includes a picture of the country that he lives in and its whole entire layout, where all the different capital cities are and all the different places that Aragon will visit throughout his adventures. So, you got multiple different races that are having to live alongside each other in this country. You have the humans, you have dwarves, kind of like in Lord of the Rings, and you have elves, and then you have the Urgles, which is kind of like this story's version of orcs, if you will, but they have like ram horns on their heads, and they're like these very gigantic humanoid. They're people. Let's be real. I'm not going to call them creatures because they are people. But you also have dragons, which at this point in the story are of myth at this point because we'll get into that later. And then you have a race called the Razek, which also weren't exactly represented the best in the movie. They're basically these humanoid crow like creatures that are capable of speech and other things, but they're very vicious in the way that they fight. And most people that encounter these don't live to tell the tale, if you get what I mean. But they also have another stage in their existence. They call them like the parents, if you will. I can't remember the exact term they use for it. You'll see a lot of that in this book, where they're like much more gigantic and evolved and just much more of a monstrous creature. But more on that later. So basically, you have a king named Galbatorix, who's an evil king who's ruling over the land, who destroyed the race of dragon riders that existed many years before, and has pretty much just been chilling at the throne ever since. And that's the world that everybody's living in. They're under the oppression of his army and things like that. Typical medieval stuff. But the moment Aragon encounters this blue dragon that came out of the sapphire, he eventually realizes he himself has become a dragon rider by being bonded with this particular dragon. That was the whole reason the dragon hatched in the first place. And now, suddenly, he's a magic user. Now, he travels with this character after things go all to hell in his home village, Carvajal, and this character's name is Brahm. And Brahm becomes a mentor or instructor to him. And they have to travel the land, trying to avoid the Razek, which are tailing him, trying to find him so they can take him to the king. And the whole time, Brahm is teaching him how to use magic. And this is another semi poorly represented thing in the movie. Magic in this series is so much more complex than what it was visualized in the movie. So basically, you have intent and then the ability to use magic to bring about that intent. And there's also this thing called the ancient language, which has existed for thousands, maybe even millions of years, but it's basically a language used to describe things exactly as they are, using their true names, things like that. And all the animals and creatures of the world know this language. You can literally speak this language to an animal, say you don't mean to harm it, the animal would come up to you. Like it's that complex. And they use the ancient language in order to shape and control the use of magic. Because if you didn't do that, if you were to do something wrong with your intent, if you were to do something that was beyond your ability or capacity for magic, you could end up dying by using up all of your energy. Something as complex as trying to bring somebody back from the dead. You're literally trying to pull somebody out of something that is beyond this world, and that would take a lot of energy, and you would die before completing that task. Um, but you also learn that you can actually store magic inside of crystals and things like that for later use. And you can, over time, just store your own magic in there and then build your magic back up. And then use those reservoirs when you are low on your own magic. And it's really quite fascinating just how much detail this author put into it. And if I remember correctly, this author wrote this book series at a very young age, I believe in his teens. And so the fact that he put all this detail into it. Like it was, I was honestly impressed. And like some of the battles and the fighting scenes that are described in this book are so adult, if you will. Like it's almost like Game of Thrones level gore, if you will. Like something I never would have expected from a book series that's typically recommended towards teenagers. I can understand if it would be recommended towards young adults more so, but it's such a rich story of a whole lot of lore and history, world building, and the characters are so complex. I really enjoy going through this one. You know, honestly, wish I didn't go through it as fast as I did, but I literally could not put the books down. They were that good. But basically, the first book details Aragon's travel from his village to the dwarf population in the very high mountains towards the south. And you end up coming to this location that I can't quite remember the name of, but it's basically inside of a hollow mountain that may or may not have been a volcano at one point in time. But literally, their only source of sunlight is the hole in the top of this cavern. But you have an entire civilization living in this hollow space. That's how massive it is. And they even have structural accommodations and dwellings for dragon riders. You know, places that the dragons can fly into and rest and be fed, things like that. But it's really quite fascinating. And at this point in the story, the only ones that can become dragon riders are humans and elves because of a magical pact made years ago. In order to solve an older conflict, they decided to band together with dragons so that they wouldn't destroy each other, and it's really quite fascinating. So you have a big battle at the end of this one in the dwarf population, and there's also some character deaths that would leave you kind of a little heartbroken by the end of it. But there's a whole bunch of twists and turns yet to come, and that's how I lead into the second book, which is Eldest. And one thing I like about these books is that each book kind of has its own identity, its own color scheme. Like the first book is all blue, and the second one's all red, the third one's all yellow, and the fourth one's all green. It really just has its own thing going on with the design of it. And each dragon depicted on the cover is a dragon that you eventually meet in the story, particularly in the book that that dragon is on. So the blue dragon on the first cover is Saphira, that's Aragon's dragon, and she actually became quite sentient and was able to communicate with Aragon telepathically very early on. Like her evolution just happened so fast and her growth. And then you come into Eldest at the end of this battle, and some characters were kidnapped. Murtagh is a character you meet during Aragon, and he travels with Aragon after, you know, they leave Brom behind, if you catch my drift. And Murtagh's been kidnapped by the Urgals that attacked the dwarf civilization. And you also had the appearance of a shade in the ending of the first book. And interesting things about shades, I believe they are created by trying to control spirits for their own ends, and it ended up not working out for them. And they all kind of possessed him, if you will, and he turned into this dark creature known as a shade. And so let's just say he ends up getting dealt with at the end of the first one. So you're still reeling from this whole battle at the beginning of this book. But now the goal is to travel north to the elf population to get to their capital city. And I believe their capital city was pronounced Elis Mira, if I didn't butcher that. But they have to travel north and through the forest that's all enchanted and everything. There's all kinds of obstacles along the way. But Aragon is starting to learn that there's a more political side to things, and he's going to have to decide where he's going to have to put his loyalty. He eventually becomes part of a dwarf family, if you will, so he has brothers and sisters there, but there's also a human population dwelling with the dwarves that are actively trying to fight against Galbatorix's forces. So we'll call them the rebels, and they basically are just trying to survive at this point. And you meet a lady ruler who eventually becomes their queen, if you will, through the events at the end of the first book. And you're following her storyline as well at the same time that you're following Aragon, even though their paths have temporarily diverted. You're seeing a lot of things from her point of view. She's having to figure out, newly becoming queen at such a young age, how to deal with her opponents, her conspirators, how to keep her civilization alive and supplied while also dealing with the imminent threat at the same time. So she eventually has to pack everybody up and head to the neighboring country. I think it was called Serta, if I remember correctly. And she has to go and basically bargain with the king of that country in order to have support and supplies to just survive, to keep her people alive. And meanwhile, Aragon is headed towards the elf population to learn more about the use of magic and how to control it. And you eventually get there and you see how the elf culture works and all of their, how proper they are and how respectful they are to each other. But not saying that Aragon doesn't encounter a couple of obstacles among their civilization as well, as far as how things are done and how people view him. And because a lot of people actually view him being a human dragon rider as a detriment to what they're trying to do. They view him as weaker than what an elf dragon rider would have been. But you get to participate in all kinds of elf customs during the time that he's there. And there's one massive event or ceremony that takes place that leads to a massive transformation in Aragon, physically and mentally, spiritually, magically, all of the above. And it really helps turn the tide in how the elves view him as a whole. But more on that later. You actually also, at this point, you start to follow the storyline, which is completely and totally separate. The storyline of Aragon's cousin Roran, who basically went to go learn a trade and came back to find his home destroyed. And all pretty much because they were looking for Aragon. So now Roran has his own task ahead of him, his own adventure, and you get to see things from his point of view. He is now pretty much charged with keeping his village alive and surviving, and he packs all of them up and starts traveling them south down through the country and down through the ocean, trying to avoid Galbatorix's forces at the same time. And One thing you'll definitely see going through the series is that Roran has just as much of a difficult time, if not more of a difficult time, than Aragon does with the injuries that he sustains. Not that Aragon didn't sustain some grievous injuries himself, but Roran is having to do all of this based off of leadership alone and without being able to use magic. So he does not have a single edge at all other than his leadership skills and his ability to fight, as he quickly learns how good he's at doing. So you got basically three different storylines taking place at the same time. You have the leader of the humans that went down to Serta, you have Roran keeping his village alive, and you have Aragon trying to basically learn everything he possibly can in order to be the hope for the country that eventually stops the big bad that's ruling the country. And among his group at this point, you have his dwarf brother, which I can't remember the name of. You have it's either Arya or Arya, and she's an elf who Aragon rescues in the first book, and she starts traveling with him and all that, and she kind of becomes a bit of an interest for Aragon, but she's not all about it. She's not having it. So he's having to deal with that along with everything else. And at the end of this book, there's another big battle, and that's when you're introduced to the red dragon in the picture here, and his name is Thorn. And this is also where Murtagh comes back into the picture. He was taken to the king and presented with a red stone, which was a red dragon egg, and Thorn hatched from it. But instead of a friend and a brother to Aragon, he is now an adversary. But as you learn later on in the story, it may not be his choice. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So, going into the third book here, you have Brisingar. Now, Brisingar is the ancient language term for fire. You learned that earlier on in the series. And another thing I'll point out with this, because I took such a long break before returning to this series, I had the first two books for several years. And then once I got back into them, I realized, well, since then they went through a bit of a artistic change with the book series. And there's very few series that I own where all of the books look exactly the same. And that kind of sort of bothers me a little bit, but not too much. In fact, I think the only series that I have where all the covers look the same and they're all hardback or all paperback is the Hunger Games series. And that's only because I bought some of those after the fact. But getting back into the story here, you meet this golden dragon in the story who was kind of this big, massive secret that the elves were holding. But I won't divulge too much of what he and his dragon rider counterpart are. But basically, you hop back into Aragon learning his magical abilities and just how far he can take these abilities. And like you learn that you can actually drain energy out of living things for your own use. Like you can literally kill a plant and shrivel it up by siphoning all of its energy. But I believe it's in this book where you finally face the Razek again and finally deal with them. But this battle takes so much out of Aragon, he nearly dies just from exhausting his capacity of magic. And it really is. This is probably my favorite book in the series, just with all the different directions that it goes. And Aragon visits a whole lot more different locations, and there's really a lot more like back and forth between your main locations in order for him to accomplish the goals that he has to do. Now, he kind of grapples with a little bit of accomplishing his true purpose and the goals that he realistically needs to focus on, and then the goals that he personally wants to accomplish and feels that he needs to accomplish. And he's trying to balance all these different things. And it leads to a little bit of, prominent figures not respecting him as much, but that relationship eventually improves later on. And this book, I believe it was, ends with a big character dying at the end, but I won't spoil who it was. But it kind of leaves you like, oh man, like this got real. But you could probably see it coming from a mile away, possibly. if you're paying attention enough, because obviously some characters can't make it to the end of the story, and at some point, Eragon is going to have to do something on his own entirely in order to save the world, pretty much. So that brings me into the final book of the inheritance cycle, and this one's called Inheritance, or The Vault of Souls, I believe is another name for this book. Now, Aragon's having to do a few different things here. We're moving closer and closer to the the main capital of the country where the king resides, and we're just taking it city by city and moving forward from there. And Aragon is also taking it upon himself in order to gain more knowledge and just to kind of figure things out. He travels to the original island country of the Dragon Riders, and he learns everything that befell there. And he actually discovers something huge deep down in this country, or this volcano, if you will, that I won't spoil, but it provides a massive change and edge in what is to come later. Now, you have quite a different things going on again. You're still following Roran's story as well. He's become a part of the rebel force, if you will, and he's actually starting to gain a little bit of rank, but he also is having issues with, let's say, the command structure, if you will. He's basically taking a lot of initiative, sometimes against orders from higher ups, in order to accomplish certain battles being won. And it does work out in the end a lot of the time, but at the same time, in order to maintain order within the unit, if you will, the officers have to punish him for deviating from the orders, even though what he did allowed them to succeed. So there's quite a bit of moral things that take place in this book, in this series, if you will. But because Roran is so good of a fighter and so good of a leader, he actually earns the respect of the Urgles, because the Urgles eventually come into this story not as an adversary to all of the humans, because they have their own culture that basically, you obtain glory by battling, or, pillaging a village, for example, if you catch my drift. But you learn that they were also in some ways under the drive of King Galbatorix, like they were forced to do certain things that they didn't quite agree with. And so they eventually become an ally to the rebel forces. And it's through a whole lot of trial and tribulation and a lot of hand-to-hand combat that Roran gains the respect and even the loyalty of the Urgles. And I actually, by the end of everything, ended up liking the characters that we meet that are a part of the Urgle population. And you learn that they were a whole lot more complex and human-like than what was originally thought. And so at the end of the story, you have the big final battle, and you have the reveal. You finally have the reveal of King Galbatorix's dragon that has grown to a massive size because he's lived so long. And this is the largest dragon that anybody's ever seen. It's a black dragon. But you also learn that this dragon was not his original dragon. It is a dragon that he pretty much stole after killing its rider and brought under his control through use of the ancient language. And you also learn, I believe, in this book exactly who Brahm was, the character that you meet in the first book that doesn't make it to the end of the series. You learn who exactly he is to Aragon, and just how much of an important role beyond of what we saw at face value that he played. And it's really like heart wrenching once you find out who he is. But I won't spoil that here. You get like his whole backstory. Basically, you come to find out that he told his entire story to Saphira while Aragon was away at one point in time in the story, and basically made her swear in the ancient language that she would not tell Aragon what he told her until it was the right time. And that's another aspect of the ancient language, is that you swear oaths in the ancient language and you literally cannot break them. And there's another big reveal about the ancient language that you learn in this book, and it helps you realize just how King Galbatorix was able to rise to the level of power and control over everything that he did. So at the very end of this story, you finally meet the Green Dragon here, and I honestly cannot remember his name, but he doesn't play a massive role in the story, as you might think from seeing him on the cover. But at the end, you see all of our main team of characters finally, separating and going on their own paths. They have their own destinies and jobs that they need to do. And they're all starting to realize what their role is now in this new era. And it has a bit of a bittersweet ending for Aragon's love life. It doesn't go exactly how typical stories would go, but honestly, I felt like the ending of this series left some things open that this author could explore in the future. And now he has written some fairly newer books since then, and one of them does, in fact, cover the later on story of one of these characters because you can tell it by the name of the book. But the first book is called The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, and I haven't read that one yet, but I think it's supposed to be just tales of the country of Allegacia, either before or after the events of the main series. But the other book that he wrote is called Murtagh, and it basically is going to tell the story of where he went after the events of this final book. But I haven't read that one either, but I'm excited to hop into those. If they are halfway as good as these first four books were, then I'm definitely excited to read those. But yeah, this series comes highly recommended. I think everybody should read this series because you literally, like I've said many times in this video, you will not be able to put the book down. Like it is that good. So that's all I'm going to say on that for now. Hope everybody picks this book up in the store or get it on the Kindle, something of that nature. Just read the book. Read these books. They're very good. And that's all I got to say. So y'all have a great day.